Welcome back to Solitary, Poor, Nasty, Brutish, and Short. This week, Scott sits down with Thomas Hellmann, a leading expert in entrepreneurship, venture capital, and innovation. He serves as the DP World Professor of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the University of Oxford Saïd Business School and previously taught at Stanford and the University of British Columbia. He has also advised organizations including the World Economic Forum and numerous startup companies. Enjoy.
Thomas, thanks so much for coming on to the show.
My pleasure to be here.
How would you define a startup?
There are lots of definitions around there. Startup is relatively easy. It's, a young company, typically a commercial for-profit company. Normally, when we talk about startups, though, we also have implicitly a notion that it's not an SME, but that it has a growth orientation. So the difficult bit is always distinguishing small enterprises from startups, and startups are basically companies that that have to start small but want to be big, as opposed to SMEs, which are small companies which are happy to be small.
Tell me about Schumpeter's idea of creative destruction.
Oh, good old Schumpeter.
Yeah. Well, let's start with Schumpeter. And
Schumpeter is an interesting guy. So creative destruction is the notion that it is, a new generation of startups that are best positioned to introduce new technologies that are disruptive for the incumbents, and that for a variety of reasons the incumbents are too late, they don't respond in time, and eventually get displaced. Classic example is Netflix completely ruined Blockbuster, and there's basically nothing left of Blockbuster at this point. So that's creative destruction, and we talk about the gale of creative destruction, disruption. Clay Christensen talks a lot about these things and popularized it. So I think it's a fundamental concept in entrepreneurship. It doesn't always pan out this way, and so sometimes it gets over dramatized, because the number of times that we have truly creative destruction, meaning startup creates something and therefore destroys the incumbent, the status quo structure, it doesn't always work that way, and more often than not, you've got the startup actually being acquired by an incumbent, and so the creative destruction actually doesn't take place.
Well, we'll talk about the various exit strategies in a bit, but let's just return to Schumpeter and the time in which he was writing for a second. This is pre-Netflix. This is we're in the thick of the 20th century. The world is changing rapidly. What were some of the contemporaneous developments that he was witnessing when he came up with this theory?
I think
what was he responding to?
To be honest, I'm not a Schumpeter expert in the sense that...
you named your lab after.
I did. It wasn't me who named it. It was the guys in Toronto who did that. And it was very much the provocation around, David Goliath kind of, startups, challenging the incumbent. I do know that at that time, a big topic was basically antitrust, the rise of very powerful conglomerates, what were the big ones? Sorry, I'm terrible with names. Maybe you have to cut these bits out. The Carnegies and the Rockefellers, and there was this notion that large companies become too powerful. I think Schumpeter's argument takes a different tack on it, and saying that eventually they're going to fall and they're going to collapse on their own weight, because they're being attacked by a new generation of entrepreneurs who are just much more nimble. So I think it sort of added a nuance to I think the increasing concern about the power of strong incumbents dominating monopolies and things like that.
Yes, Thomas Kuhn he's written about the sort of the structure of scientific revolutions. It's kind of similar, right? Like new paradigms come to replace old paradigms, and it's not exactly a one-to-one comparison, but it's similar. I think in in the Valley, this idea of creative destruction has been mobilized and ingrained quite aggressively, pedantically almost over the course of the last few decades, to the point that it's move fast, break things, disrupt, innovate for the sake of innovation, and it's like break, 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 destroy.
Yeah.
It's become almost a self-perpetuating kind of ethos, at least as I see it, particularly in the American context, in Silicon Valley.
Yeah. I mean, that could be a reflection just of competition. I mean, and that paradigm has held in across some of the industries. It's quite well documented for semiconductors, where, I mean, you have, these future generations, and there was a lot of disruption. Interestingly, in the semiconductor industry, incumbents woke up to that challenge. And as you going, I mean, it's still true that, what was it, every 5 or 7 years, you have a new paradigm and a new type of chip. And NVIDIA broke, obviously, one of the, but before that, Intel actually maintained leadership over several generations. That's an example where incumbents were not as rigid, not as short-sighted as made out by sort of the classic Schumpeterian creative destruction argument. I think the limitation of the Valley is that, I mean, there's always sort of been an ethos that we want to, invest in sort of free enterprise, and anything that has the smell of government and regulated industries were avoided. Biotech and health more generally were the first ones to say, well, actually, like it or not, it's a regulated industry because health has to be regulated. Where the venture capital model, the creative destruction, really works very differently is in some of the sectors where that are more regulated. So the obvious ones are climate and fintech, and the paradigm does play out differently. And funny enough, even though the Valley is always extremely strong on a relative sense, climate tech and fintech have thrived relatively more outside of Silicon Valley. I mean, not to take away anything.
You mean geographically, or?
Yeah, geographically. I mean, put it this way. I mean, if you think of where's Europe relatively strong, fintech, they're very strong. Climate tech, they're strong. Not in absolute, but in relative terms. And I think it is because, actually, I think the mentality and the understanding that you can't just live with the, break something paradigm, break some eggs paradigm. In some sense, I think Silicon Valley didn't always know how to play fintech, because the philosophy was just, break the eggs. And you can't do that in fintech in the same way. I mean, and even...
because why? The players will eat you? Because
it's a regulated industry. You can't... The type of experimentation, the kind of thing, just try it and see if it works, and if it doesn't work, you can't do that. You might go to prison, you might,
And people do. Thinking of crypto in particular.
Sure. Absolutely. But no, what I'm saying is, I'm just sort of pointing out, I mean, entrepreneurship is fundamentally about breaking paradigms, and it's fundamentally about experimenting things. But the way that experimentation works, and the radicalness of these efforts is different in the energy sector than in the fintech sector than in the software sector. I mean, there are just so few. There are very few barriers to really trying new things in software. But if you're doing things in energy, you're much more constrained. If you're doing things in fintech, you are much more constrained.
I wonder if that. Do you know Shoshana Zuboff at all? She wrote a book called Surveillance Capitalism.
No,
she's a Harvard Business School professor. She may be emeritus now. And she's talked about, the commodification of data and the end of privacy, and she traces a sort of longer genealogy of this. I wonder if, because tech was always a little bit less regulated, infinitely scalable, regulation is always going to lag behind innovation, that the enormous amount of capital that went into and came out of tech companies built around mining and then selling data, using people as vectors of data collection,
Sure.
I wonder if that's because there was always, less regulation around that than there was around, arms manufacturing.
That's an ongoing debate. Obviously, Europe has GDPR. That's
a joke.
Stringent.
A GDPR is a joke. What is why does that? This is totally.
You call it a joke, but there are many people who didn't.
Sorry, I don't mean to offend you, but let's put the subject of the GDPR on here for a second. What's the thinking? It's not enforceable. It's just kind of a mess.
I'm not going to try to defend GDPR, but I think it's sometimes a bit naive to just say it's a joke, because it is a regulation.
That's a provocative American in me.
I know. But I mean, I do think Europe has tried to address externalities and harmful aspects of exactly the kind of data privacy problem that you've alluded to. Like, our regulation is incredibly difficult, and it never works the way you want, and it imposes huge costs. All I'm saying is I'm not putting any value judgment on this. I'm just saying this is one of the reasons why certain parts of the European ecosystem have been slowed down. GDPR, I mean, most entrepreneurs hate GDPR. I'm not going to therefore say GDPR is useless, because there are many parts to our society.
There are.
You just alluded to the fact that there's been a real concern around privacy.
I do. Maybe I shouldn't take such a strong position. I mean, on the one hand, I am specifically the kind of, regulation-loathing entrepreneur who would dislike something like this. On the other hand, I think there's a real problem with privacy, or lack of privacy. And, the question, the real debate, I mean, there's a philosophical debate to be had about the value of privacy. There's a woman here working on this named Carissa Valise. She's quite good. But there's the other question is then, okay, what do you do about it? How do you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing, put it this way.
Maybe I shouldn't have called it a joke.
No, that's fine. We're having a good conversation. I think the subtlety about all of these regulations, I think what an entrepreneurship perspective brings to that is the hidden costs of regulation, and that you feel very strongly in entrepreneurship. The hidden costs of regulation is that you don't know what new initiative you are hindering, killing, because of let me assume a well-intended regulation that's trying to regulate current, or frankly sometimes past behavior, and the regulator cannot see that this will prevent new experimentation, new things that you can do, maybe with data, maybe with it means it's been a big issue in finance that when the regulations were made, you never foresaw that they would kill something new. One of the most interesting developments, I've done a bit of research on that, is the sandboxes. So interestingly enough, the UK has been the first country in the world, and has been now imitated by over other 50 countries, is to create sandboxes which are deliberately create safe spaces for entrepreneurs as well as established companies, but it's mostly for entrepreneurs, to try out new solutions in regulated industries that allow them to see whether they make sense, and give the regulator a chance to basically create new exemptions so that new products can be brought under the market, because they were impossible under the old market. I don't know if you got a chance.
No. Tell me more about sandbox.
So I think this is one of the
and I had
real successes.
As a child.
Yeah, exactly, and that's the name. But I mean, it started basically with the UK regulator, what they call again, the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, and this is now over 10 years ago, that they basically created a program. It was kind of presented as an accelerator program. It was an accelerator program, but they admitted cohorts of projects. The majority of projects were startups. Some of the big banks also submitted projects, and for a period of 6 months, and then it could be prolonged or so on, they could do certain financial transactions that were in a gray zone, or frankly in a red zone of current financial regulation, but they were doing it under the auspice of the regulator to see whether this works. And so these companies could develop new financial concepts that then basically helped two things. It helped the company to figure out whether this business model works, and it helped the regulator to learn about the power of new technologies, and then they could basically start a process of making these things legal. So I think it's actually a brilliant concept. If it's been now used in climate tech as well, so we're seeing climate sandboxes, and I mean the model is actually, I think, quite successful.
Well, what happens at the end of the grace period if the regulator decides they don't like what you were doing, but it was a good business model?
Then you've clarified it. One of the things, our research, what we're actually showing in our research is, and this is we actually haven't written this up yet, but we're in the process of writing it, is that what you're seeing when these companies enter the sandbox, it sends a signal to the broader industry that the regulator is open to X. X could be new lending models. It could be new payment models. I mean, there's so many, it could be insurtech. And what you're then seeing is actually venture capitalists putting more money into that sector. Just a signal that there's an openness and it's not a rigid regulation, and the regulator is willing to look at these things, sends a positive signal to the market, and we see these sectors taking off. I mean, and I mean, if you look at entrepreneurship in the UK, fintech is the number one success story.
Why do you think? Let's turn back the clock a little bit, and then I want to ask you about Oxford. Why, in your opinion, did tech sort of become king? The idea is you have tech, you're not manufacturing anything physical, so it's infinitely scalable. There's no limit, there's no capacity. Why over the last however many decades do you think it was? I guess it would be after .com.
Yeah.
During .com, was tech the thing that took over the world? Why are most of you see all the billionaires being minted? Most of them are in tech. They're not in automotive manufacturing. What's just the sort of the simple to dumbed down story?
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, it surprised me because every time you see a new generation of digital technologies, and obviously the .com was the big one, and now we've got the AI revolution, and there were a few in between. And you every time think, okay, software won again. Eventually, hardware is going to catch up. And I mean, for the last 30 years, software always won. So it does make you wonder. I mean, I guess we've underestimated the power of information. We've underestimated the power of intelligence. And there is a limit. I mean, and in fact, if you now look at the composition of venture capital and stuff like that, hardware has become more important, and I mean, obviously it's huge. It's huge in the space industry. It's huge in the energy industry. Obviously integrated with and with software. Defense is huge, absolutely. And then the whole. I mean, I do think the whole. I mean, there's some really interesting developments on the life science side. It's not hardware, but it's physical molecules and medical instruments and stuff like that.
Yeah.
The frustration for them is always that their development cycles are inherently constrained by the physical world, and therefore these things take 15 years to develop as opposed to 2 months. But that's. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but I think you answered your question almost yourself, which is the software has the scalability and now the speed. That means that the progress is just enormous.
Where were you during .com? Where were you in your career in the world?
I was in the Silicon Valley.
And so you were out. Okay, you were.
I was at Stanford, and we were absolute geniuses, and we knew everything.
Doing your PhD or what?
By that time, I had finished my PhD. I was an assistant professor at the Stanford School of Business, and I mean, it was a fantastic time. I mean, absolutely fascinating. I learned tons from the best people. Obviously, by 2001, March 2001, when everything came down, there was a brief moment where I was worried that I'm going to have to go back and study banking. which I dreaded. And I never had to do that because venture capital and entrepreneurship never stopped. But I think, it was a wonderful experience. The dynamic of the boom and bust, though, well, things look very familiar today when you've lived through the dot-com boom.
Okay, so what did you do your PhD in at Stanford?
So I was an economist. I had fantastic advisors that I'm very grateful to. I was actually just interested in financial economics. One of my advisors was Joseph Stiglitz, who went on to get the Nobel Prize, and it was
That's familiar. That's great.
He
was one of your advisors. That's great.
One of the most inspiring individuals and thinkers, and loved every minute. I had another advisor who's actually super interesting. There was Professor Masahiko Aoki, Japanese early Marxist economist, and turned much more thinking about financial systems and comparative economics. So he was, one of the leading Japan experts. And for some reason, I decided that I would study the Japanese main banking system because I was just so fascinated by him. Until one day, I sat in his office and, I can't quite do his wonderful Japanese accent, but he basically told me, Thomas, you're a smart guy, but I don't think you really understand Japan. And so maybe you should study something different. And instead of studying Japanese banks, why don't you study these venture capitalists here? They're quite interesting. They kind of do things that you might be interested in. And literally that one sentence changed my life. And I studied venture capital, and it's been the best ride and topic. I couldn't be more thankful to him.
Do you have, I suppose, are they economists or they political theorists, but do you have strong feelings either way on, Mises, Hayek, this sort of the Austrian school?
To be honest, these are old ideas, and I think they're all had, interesting aspects to it, but the way they conceive the world, today we've just have a much deeper understanding. The Austrian school, in some sense, was about entrepreneurship as a disequilibrium phenomenon. There's other aspects about libertarian and free markets, and to be honest, economics has moved on a long way, and I think we've got a much more nuanced understanding than those early days. I think they did. At the time, they advanced our understanding, and there was a pushback basically to saying, everything is an equilibrium system. So I think that's really useful. If you study entrepreneurship, you have to think about disruption, you have to think about change and all of these things. So I like them, but to be honest, they're not relevant today anymore.
Okay. Even the sort of the Keynesian, Hayekian battle, you can still see some of that.
Well, there's some stuff in macroeconomics. I'm not a macroeconomist, where we still have debates between Keynesian economics and stuff like that. But I think our understanding, remember, even when I started my PhD, we studied a lot of theories, and we had these different ideological views, and it was super interesting. And all of this was in the absence of data. And in the last 20, 30 years, we've generated so much data about what's actually happening in the economy that some of these theories, I still like just being aware of them, but we don't have the sort of, frankly, slightly naive views that they had of the world.
Who's we? The current economics?
But I would say a very broad community of economics. I'm in the business school, so it's much larger. Management scholars, there's marketing, strategy. We all know so much more about business and how business actually work. The people who wrote these papers, in before 1960, they actually hardly knew what a business really does and how a business really works. So I think we just understand the phenomenon at a much greater level of granularity.
Yeah, someone told me the other day that they're thinking about doing a PhD in economics, and they're saying it's mostly just math. All the requirements to get in, all the requirements to for the first 2 years are like a lot of them are the same as just math classes.
Sure. We're very.
When are you doing economics? They're like, a few years down the line, but it's become hyper quantitative.
Absolutely, but even that's going to It's in the process of changing. It was very mathematical. When I was a graduate student, we did, a lot of advanced mathematical optimization theories and stuff like that. It then became extremely econometric, so empirical data. And right now it's being transformed with AI. So the power of data has become so powerful that some of that mathematical structure, it's great if you need to have some background. You definitely need, but you also now need a whole dimension of just understanding data and data generating processes. And funny enough, I think the mathematical part will become easier because all these machines solve everything for you on the math side. You now have to understand what it actually means.
Yeah, and how to harness the machines.
Yeah.
Just sort of shifting gears a little bit, what are the relative benefits and pitfalls of taking VC money? In the circles that I run in New York, most of my friends either are investors or entrepreneurs. I have a few friends in sort of more traditional banking, consulting jobs, but the majority of the fish I swim among either have companies or invest in companies. And it's a subject that comes up a lot. There's a lot of antipathy towards VCs. People, they take it, they take the money begrudgingly, but they don't want to, or they say don't take it unless you have to. You see both.
Oh yeah, it's a great debate.
It's a big discussion.
Absolutely. And there are many facets to it. And yeah, I mean, for some people, sort of taking venture capital is going over to the dark side, and that's the language venture capitalists use themselves jokingly. I mean, there's a couple of things one just has to understand about venture capital. There's a big difference between venture capitalists and angel investors.
Angel investors, your papers.
Yeah, I've done research on that. But angel investors invest their own money, and they're essentially accountable to no one or accountable to their spouse. Venture capitalists take other people's money, and they're accountable to their so-called LPs, limited partners, and these can be pension funds, these can be some wealth funds. Yeah. And so the venture capitalists themselves live under very clear incentives and constraints. And they're bound to create some tension with the founders. I think the discussion is then there's a second level of confusion that founders have to be clear about what they want. And there's a co-author of mine, a colleague of mine, colleague in the profession called Noam Wasserman, who wrote a beautiful book called The Founder's Dilemma. And, in that, so one of his central frameworks is, he says, as a founder, you have to decide, do you want to be rich or do you want to be king? And that's a great framework for thinking. Rich means I want to build the largest possible company. I'm going to have to share the wealth created by this company. King means I'm in control of the company, but I'm not going to get as rich, because essentially if you want control, there's a price that you pay in terms of upside, because you're not creating the best possible organization. You're creating the organization that you can still control. Now, if you're ambitious,
you try to do both. You try to be a rich king.
Everybody does that. Obviously, that's the first response. Get and obviously we have examples of people who manage to do both. But I think that in some sense, in Noam's framework, that misses the point that most founders have to make these choices, and it is. The choice becomes very clear when you do facing this sort of venture capital question. The reason some people really don't like venture capitalists is this was the point where they had to give up control. They did so reluctantly, or they didn't understand that they were giving up control, and they resented losing that control because they couldn't do with their company the things that they wanted to do anymore. On the other hand, if you take somebody else's money, then you have a different level of accountability, and you have to live with these people whether you like them or not. And so basically, if you take venture capital, you're setting yourself up for that challenging thing. The data, though, is pretty clear that on average, always with some exceptions, but on average, companies by venture capital have much more aggressive growth and much more success than the ones who try to do it on their own or just with angel capital. So that's where I think this animosity is coming from, because actually founders themselves have to make tough choices between control or growth.
I mean, you're not totally, you're never really totally free of constraints, though. I suppose if you have like a one-person operation, but at some point you're going to have a board. Let's say that you somehow manage to get your non-VC backed company listed, then someone could just buy up all the shares. You have you have a board. The board depends. What who.
I mean,
what are the voting
interestingly enough,
shares? Yeah.
typically a startup doesn't have a board until it gets venture capital. They have your advisors, but you don't have to have a board by itself. At least in most jurisdictions, there's some exceptions, but you get a board the moment you're accountable to somebody, and venture capital is typically when this thing becomes serious, right? So most angels don't even really, sometimes they have a little board, but it's not really a board, and the founders effectively control, their destiny. It's really interesting, because if you go back to the motivation, why do people become entrepreneurs? Independence and being the master of your own fate is a huge driver.
Yeah.
Which is why we shouldn't be surprised at the moment the venture capitalist comes in.
They get upset.
Well,
because
this is a set of people.
Funding rounds later, yeah.
Exactly. And so, I mean, these conflicts are everywhere. I think one of the things that has changed, and to be honest, I think by some measure improved it, is there was a whole movement around founder-friendly venture capitalists.
And they all pretend, and I'm the easiest to work with.
Yeah, I mean, obviously these things, but no, I do think that the mentalities have changed, and I mean, this is something we're actually, I feel quite passionate about, is that I think there's a greater willingness today to let founders, including maverick founders, and also including technical founders, to give them a little bit of leeway.
The dog off the leash.
Yeah. And what we therefore really need is we need to prepare our founders to go further along the journey so that they can actually manage these things properly.
Yeah. Well, sometimes they go off the rail. I mean, even some, I get approached every now and then from whether it's VC or angel or whatever, and they it's almost the VCs have to pitch you now.
Watch that space. It's going to get even more so. That's going to be even more true in a world in which every VC has the same AI filter and everybody sees the same deals. And founders, I think founders are going to get more power because of AI, because access to investors has dramatically improved.
Is it access to investors, or just more? Is there more capital going towards early stage companies, or is there just more access to the same amount of capital?
No, I think for any given amount of capital, any founder now finds it easier to get under the screen of a large number of investors.
Yeah.
Just because, basically the whole thing is intermediated by AI. If you get the wrong business, you're not going to get through the filter. If you get the right business, all of a sudden, I mean, literally, we were just talking to a bunch of entrepreneurs literally this weekend, and one of them said, I just did a fundraising campaign. I used AI. I sent my, it was a late stage deal, but I sent my deck to over 1,000 investors. Was it? I'm trying to remember if it was 1,000 or it was 10,000. I think it was 10,000.
Sure, you can automate the outreach.
Just automate it. It said, it said actually we spent 3 days in automating our letter in Claude so that it's actually personalized to every VC, picks up individual details about the VC, puts them in the cover. 50 responses. Now, you might say 50 out of 10,000, that's nothing. Sorry. 50 responses for a founder is amazing. Yeah. And they said they were invited to pitch in 50, and that gave the company huge power, because all of a sudden not all 50 of them want to invest, but they did the round extremely successfully.
So in this world that you've described of the sort of AI filter and I forget what they're called. What do they call application management, whatever, AT, right. Whatever, like is people applying to jobs and nobody reads it. It's all just
exactly. It's a general phenomenon.
It's an old joke of like, or it's not an old joke, it's a new joke. Someone told me it's like instead of talking on a dating app, like my AI will talk to your AI, and if the AI is agreed, then
Absolutely.
they'll set up a meeting.
Exactly.
They set the meeting on Google Calendar,
Absolutely. That's the world we're in already.
Okay, so in this world, I wonder if there's a place for the kind of cocktail napkin deals, handshake deals, like meeting people in person, that kind of thing. I think there would almost be I'm speaking from what I like. I like chatting with people. I like, looking people in the eye. I like getting to know who someone is. It's kind of the old European style of doing business, I suppose.
I don't think Europe has a monopoly on that. I think it's human.
Sure. I mean, it's you have 3 days of meetings. The first day you don't talk about business at all, kind of thing.
Right. Right. That never happened in the VC world. Nobody has that patience that you have in other business circles. No, but look, I think you're talking about something really interesting. So 2 responses.
Organic human stuff rather than Claude.
Yeah. But so I think at least for the moment, these things may change in the next 5 years again. But for the moment, at the very early stages of starting companies, angel investors play a bigger role, and these guys are not that interested in using all of these AI tools. They want to continue looking in the eye of the
You're talking about pre-seed, seed.
Pre-seed, exactly. And so I think the human touch, the conviction based on, the coffee and the napkin and is alive and well. And the angel investors, I had one of them in my class 2 weeks ago. He's been doing this for a long time, and he continues to do that. And it's all about how the founders talk to him and whether he can get convinced by who they are and what they do and how they look at the world. And it's a lot of character assessment, not just the business assessment, and that stuff hasn't gone away. The VCs, who are much more structured, they don't work that way. That's to say, my AI filter talks to yours. But there's a process, and the really interesting thing is that in that process, they certainly have not eliminated the founder interviews. In fact, these founder interviews become more important because the other part of the evaluation is more standardized. Greater weight is going to be put on, how the founder interviews went. For the first time, VCs have to think much more carefully about what their actual founder evaluation model is. They've always been implicit. Suddenly you're working with AI agents who don't understand the VC's own preferences for what they consider a good founder, and they have to be more precise in saying, I'm looking for this, I'm not looking for that. So there's actually the human element isn't gone. On the contrary, one of the sort of, surprises is that the venture capital industry, I think, will become more disciplined and more thoughtful about what founders they consider good or bad, investable, non-investable. The big question is, are we going to amplify historic biases, or are we going to address historic biases?
What does that mean?
Well, the industry is known to have a terrible record on diversity. 2% all female teams, 17% mixed gender teams, so that's 20. That's only gender. If you're looking at ethnicity, tiny fractions of this is US data, tiny fraction of Latino, Black founders. If you look at the composition of the industry, over 80% male, white male. So the key issue is, as the AI tools are in some sense forcing us to evaluate people, we have a chance to address that. We have to start becoming aware. We can become aware. And the answer isn't, we're going to do 50-50 on everything. We have to be thoughtful about, what kind of founders do we really want, and to what extent are we biased or influenced by, these kind of criteria. I just think it's a chance for the industry to evolve. It doesn't mean that these statistics are going to jump, to a 50-50 share anytime soon. but we have a choice. Funny enough, I emphasize that beyond gender and ethnicity, there's a whole bunch of other biases that people have, and I think it's getting really interesting. To what extent is this industry mostly attracted to extroverts who are good at pitching, as opposed to maybe introverts who are better at managing people?
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
Sure. Why do you think it is that when we hear about unicorns, the founders are often have a kind of cult of personality around them? The founder is, the supreme salesman. We know this today, Adam Newman, and like you hear the stories of Travis Kalanick, of just individuals who were performance artists, who were master salespeople, who in their personal life appeared to do esoteric things, like there's a picture of Adam.
There are many
Newman around
aspects, but
what is the why do you think the
challenge you on-
theatricality is a big thing?
I'll challenge you on one thing. There are multiple dimensions to that, and we're not going to cover all of that today. But I mean, I literally had somebody the other day saying, "Oh, it's okay to be a solo founder." I mean, because Bill Gates was a solo founder. Well, that's just wrong, because Bill Gates had Paul Allen, and the world knows Bill Gates, and much fewer people know Paul Allen. But there were two co-founders. One of them was the flashy Bill Gates isn't even the most flashy, right? But with a more visible personality. Maybe the better example is the Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, right? You cannot imagine Apple being successful without Steve Wozniak. People don't talk about it because he's the quiet guy. He doesn't have all of the,
The stuff.
Thank you. And without a doubt, you wouldn't have an Apple without Steve Jobs either, right? So I actually think it's quite interesting to think about these as a team combination, and you often have the maverick type, or the extrovert, or the salesperson, and all of that, but typically they're counterbalanced by somebody else.
It's a bit like the prime minister and the king. They serve different roles.
Well, I'm certainly not going to comment on royalty and British politics.
No, I mean,
you can be sure of that.
Wozniak and Jobs performed fundamentally different roles. I think you're right, and I think that's a good point, which brings us to another spicy question about equity splitting. I saw you'd written a bit about that as well. The traditional thinking, me and my friend get together, you want to split it 50-50, or if you don't, someone gets the short end of the stick. A lot of times later on in the company's life cycle, people get angry, especially after multiple funding rounds, or especially approaching some kind of exit. They say, "Oh, this guy doesn't do anything anymore. This guy doesn't come in." You talk to both founders separately, and both of them say that that they do all the work.
Sounds like you've seen a bit of that.
This is sort of the classic one. I do all the work, really.
Yeah.
And you have this perspective, as far as I understand it, that sometimes 50-50 is not the appropriate way to split co-founder equity.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, in fact, I'll talk about two papers there, and one of them was someone who I mentioned earlier on, and there we basically looked at whether founder teams that do an equal split are more or less likely to raise funding. That was our performance metric, and we found that equal splitters are less likely to raise funding. The big question was, is this a symptom or is this a cause? Is equal splitting the cause of a fundraising difficulty?
I'm sorry.
So
equal split is less likely to raise money?
Equal split is less likely to get money. So the equal splitters, the guys
what
who do
stage?
it, this is first round. So,
After pre-seed and seed. Or like at the beginning. I don't mean to get to pedantic.
No. I mean, the whole language of pre-seed and seed is actually very new. And what we had was basically first funding round. It was angel or VC round.
Okay, yeah.
And it doesn't matter what label you give to it. But so no, we looked at the likelihood that you're actually raising, capital from angels or VCs. corporate citizens as well, but it's insignificant. So if the team does an equal split, we found that it was less likely that they actually raise capital. We ask, does the equal split cause you problems, or is the equal split a symptom of something else that creates a difficulty to raise funding? And the key insight from this story is actually more or less a symptom, in the sense that what we find is that teams that do an equal split but spend a lot of time negotiating it, they sit down, they have long conversations, and at the end of those conversations, they decide to do an equal split. Those teams are equally likely to get funding as the ones who have an unequal split. It is the ones who do an equal split and don't spend any time on it, or do what we call a quick handshake, that are the ones that have difficulty fundraising. And it basically says, if you don't think about it, and if you're not willing to go through a tough negotiation process and work it out among the founders at the beginning, that's probably a sign that you haven't, you missed an important step. And maybe you're just reluctant to make tough choices. Maybe you're reluctant to have tough conversations, and that shows up later.
So let's say you have 4 guys, right? And you just split, or 3 is maybe more realistic. So you have 3 co-founders, right? And you split them all on 30-something%, right?
Yeah.
When you're talking about not an equal split, are you talking about giving one 34 and one 32, or are you talking about meaningfully different splits?
Yeah. And funny enough, that didn't matter. We looked at that. But the big difference is between those who have basically the egalitarian solution and some differentiated solution. And so
it could be 80-20. It could be a hugely differentiated solution.
Those things in our data didn't show any effects to whether you take big or small differentiated stake. It's, do you have an egalitarian or a differentiated allocation? And that is, and that's what mattered. In a second study, we actually sort of took that forward. It's really interesting, because we asked, well, when do you change it? Because, in the way you set up the question, you ask, well, later on, they fall out, or they're unhappy, or they say one person does more work than the other. So we then looked, when do you break away from an equal split? Or when do you change the relative stakes where one founder suddenly gets more than the other, often through option packages or other things? What we find is that that seems to be largely driven by investors. So we see that relative founder stakes change rarely. They change extremely rarely when people started with an equal split. So if we started with an equal split, it's unlikely that we're going to move away from it, or less likely. If we started from an unequal split, more likely that we change it further down the road. And these changes typically coincide with financing rounds. So basically investors putting some pressure on the founders, or alternative interpretations. We're in disagreement. We're not happy with our equity split. We can't agree on how to fix this. We have to wait till we get in the financing round and get the arbitration, in some sense, from an investor who says, guys, this is how you got to do it.
You have to have mom and dad police the sibling argument.
Exactly.
But I think it's hard. Well, obviously, you're going to have a tough conversation. And maybe you walk away with the result of the handshake.
You'd be surprised how many founders do not think about this. I mean, I teach this.
No, I'm not surprised at all.
You're not surprised at all. Yeah, no. I think it's really important because there are so many things that are going on.
No, you want to build a company, you want to do that. I'm not surprised that the conversation doesn't happen. What I'm surprised at is that the guy who gets less equity is okay with that in the beginning. Like, how would that work? Like, how does everyone go ahead and march forward happily with one person having meaningfully less equity than the other? Not by a couple of percent. Maybe they bring some investors with them. They bring experience. Everyone's bringing something different, right? But you're talking to your students, right? And you're like, guys, you're going to co-found. How would you advise these people? Because one of you maybe should take less equity. What do you tell them?
Yeah.
What do you tell that person?
So we literally do a negotiation in class, and we get them to experience it. It's one thing me telling them. I actually get them to experience how to negotiate these things and what it feels like to be on the short end, or the long end of that negotiation.
Maybe the shorter end isn't really the shorter end. It comes with ancillary perks or whatever.
Exactly. No,
You can leave at 6 o'clock,
well, one of them, sometimes you trade off equity against salary. There are differences in seniority and experience. So if one of them has 5 more years or has done a prior startup, you're going to compensate that. There is sort of a notion, that's something we talk about in classes, really interesting conversation, whether you sort of should have a leader premium. So should the CEO, just by virtue of being the CEO, get a higher equity stake? And that's a great debate to have. I don't think there's a single right answer to that. Some people believe that's true. Other people say no, that's absolutely not true. I've seen it successfully in companies that didn't give the CEO a bigger stake, but they had the conversation about it. Again, it's, I think, the rigor with which you debate these things that sets the foundation for a good team.
Tough conversations.
Oh, yes.
No, yeah.
And one of the insights that Noam actually really emphasized in his book is don't think of this as a one-off conversation, because these issues come back. And sometimes you have to renegotiate, and you renegotiate over time. And then stuff happens in life. Yeah. And the contract that you thought makes sense doesn't make sense anymore, because suddenly somebody doesn't have the visa to continue working on the venture, or, has a family emergency, or, life happens and these things have to be readjusted.
Well, when I find myself in a pickle like this, I'll return to this conversation, or I'll look up your phone number. If we move to the sort of later stage of the life cycle, maybe the end stage of the life cycle by some definitions, as we also approach the end of our conversation's life cycle here, I want to talk about exit strategies and exit options. Scaling up, selling out.
Yeah.
Selling to the incumbent. There's been a lot of direct listings in recent years. So you have a company, you grow it, you have some silly valuation that's completely divorced from reality. You've done well. You've been at this however long, 5, 10 years, whatever it is. Probably closer to 10. And it comes time to get out somehow. You're going to list, you're going to scale, you're going to sell. What are the options, and how do you go about thinking about this?
Yeah,
I know there's no general advice.
No. I mean, it's a really important choice. There are many ways of answering this question. You can answer it from the individual founder. You can answer it from the perspective of the company, of the board of directors. You think it's the founder who decides. It may or may not be, but it's actually the board, and then it depends who's got power on the board. And then there's a third level, which I find the most interesting to think about. This is from the perspective of the ecosystem, and ecosystem meaning country or region, or So one of the favorite ways I like to think about that is DeepMind. And you think of the story of DeepMind. 2014, Google comes along, and after a healthy negotiation, buy the company for 400 million pounds. And at the time, investors were very happy and thought it was a good exit. And you look at it today and you say, really? Did we sell DeepMind for 400 million? Now there's a longer debate about that, but why did DeepMind sell to Google in 2014? Because they couldn't see a way of building a very large, successful company in Europe at the time. And there weren't the resources, there wasn't the capital especially. And so selling was the only way. Now, maybe it was the best decision, but there are people, I'm not saying that I advocate that, but there are people who are saying, well, this is one of the moments where Europe lost a lot of its own sovereignty because we don't have an AI champion, and DeepMind would have been the obvious champion, but we sold to Google, right? So I think there's a really interesting debate at the ecosystem level. And this is one of the themes I'm quite passionate about. Done a little bit of policy work on this, is that from an ecosystem perspective, these early exits are actually quite painful because you're not building the anchor companies. Google had its good reason for buying DeepMind. DeepMind had its good reason for selling to Google, and we can understand why the transaction happened. But if you want to build a really strong ecosystem, you gotta build some of these companies that do list to go public, that don't sell too early. So, I mean, to be honest, I think, and I'm obviously taking a bit of a European perspective in this interview, but the fact that now Revolut is a publicly listed company, that Wise is publicly listing, is a big deal. These are anchor companies that are going to have a huge impact on, European startups. The fact that listing in Europe alone wasn't an option also says that how much work we still have to do. The fact that, these things have to be listed in the US. And obviously from the company perspective, they got to list wherever's the best market.
Why do you think that is, that if you have a successful startup in Europe, you're probably pretty soon in your life
the
span?
US has by far the deepest capital market, stock market, acquisition market. The US acquisition market is much bigger. I think the fragmentation that we have in Europe in the capital markets is, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. Unfortunately, these things are politically very complicated, and I'm not sure you're aware of this, but there's been a talk in European circles in Brussels about the capital market union. That talk is now, I think we've been talking about
a
for
what,
8
sorry?
years. A capital market union. And, the major progress in the last 6 years, talking about capital union, that we've renamed it the Investment and Savings Union. But we haven't done it. We're just talking about it. So and it is integration of capital markets. It's super complicated.
Of course.
Now, we're not the only ones who are struggling with this. And frankly, we are shooting ourselves in the foot with this big time. We're not the only ones. I'm not sure if you know anything about Canada, but Canada doesn't have the stock market that it has, because in Canada, stock markets are regulated by the provinces. And so, Alberta and British Columbia and Ontario have different stock market regulations. The US doesn't. It has one market, and that's hugely valuable.
That's an enormous project. I guess at a simpler, at a more local level, to the extent that there is one, and maybe the fragmentation of capital markets would preclude something like this. But I guess the more simply phrased question is: look, you have some guys in Paris who start a company, or some guys in Amsterdam, or some guys in Berlin's not as good of an example, but you have some guys in Paris or Amsterdam or London, and they start a company. London's also not a good example. Or, I don't know, Lisbon. They start their company. How do you keep them in that city rather than having, exporting your talent?
I mean, it's a huge issue.
Sorry, we keep taking
quite
your
interested.
guys.
No. I'm doing research on some of this. So, I think they're all great questions. Absolutely great questions.
Subsidies, incentives,
So,
but also there's the myth.
I think not doing anything is foolish. And, we know that countries suffer from brain drain.
Because the U.S. will just keep poaching them.
Sure. And, people move where the opportunity is biggest. And if you're a founder, in some sectors, it's really quite brutal. I've seen a lot of it in the life sciences. Life science companies have such a huge incentive to move to the US. 80% of healthcare spending happens in the US, where you're going to build your company, and the US market is so much bigger. So we've got a huge, we're losing huge number of good healthcare companies that, move to the US. I don't know if you know this, but there's a bit of a joke in the UK, which is that, the NHS is the place where companies go to die. Because, you're just stuck in the system.
Can't comment on that.
No, so that's just a reality. And the margin that I want to work on, the margin that I think the opportunity is that there is brain drain and there's brain regain. And I think our understanding of and our leveraging of brain regain is underdeveloped.
What does that mean? What is regain?
And so the most famous examples of this is actually how the Taiwanese build their tech industry, and they build their tech industry not by trying to people from Vietnam preventing to go to the US, but by giving incentives for Taiwanese to come back and spend time in Taiwan.
Sure.
That's the brain regain. And so they build all the experiences in the valley or wherever, and then in the later stages of their life come back.
Sure.
And I think there's a huge margin. We could do so much more on brain regain.
Do you know any examples of companies who, instead of running off to the US, go to, I don't know, the UAE or China or somewhere with just, for eye-watering sums of money and sell out that way?
Yes, we're seeing that. You're
seeing a couple of young European founders.
Certainly MENA region. Part of it is actually we have great founders from the MENA region also coming here for their education and then going back. But yes, you're starting to see people considering either starting a company or at least relatively early on opening an office in Dubai. Obviously in the last 6 months that's been more difficult, but I think there's
What about China, Russia? Like someone comes up with a payments platform, someone like new hot thing. They're Dutch, they're Portuguese, Spanish, whatever. Have you seen any examples of those kids, instead of going to Silicon Valley, taking a huge sum of money to go elsewhere?
I haven't seen it. It may exist, but
I haven't seen it either.
I don't think it's a prominent phenomenon. I think China is just. There's a huge number of Chinese entrepreneurs. Some of them educated in the West, but they're in a much better position to understand it, how to build a company in China. I'm not aware of anybody going to Russia for entrepreneurship. I may have missed it, but I'm certainly not aware of it. I think there's interesting movement, but look, the big attraction is the US, and that's the main question. There is a bit of a question within Europe, and then London up until Brexit was the magnet within Europe, and it attracted unbelievable talent. But obviously with Brexit, they made that more difficult.
So what are the current hubs in Europe? I'm sorry.
Paris is very strong. Paris is attracting, and I especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, people always underestimate the French, and my favorite one on that is President Bush saying the French have no word for entrepreneurship. It's a French word. So I think people always underestimate the French. Paris has a really strong ecosystem. They have done a lot of good policies. I've got a doctoral student that I supervised who wrote a whole thesis on how European venture capital industry developed, and he basically identified that the French approach, even though we had a fair amount of government intervention, was by far the most successful, and they've built a strong industry. Berlin is actually very strong.
Yeah, that's why I took it off. That's why I took Paris and Berlin off my list from Berlin.
Yeah, Munich is becoming stronger. There's some subtle differences. Berlin is software, Munich is hardware and defense, stuff like that. But they've got very strong universities now. Those are the big ones. I always think that, I'm always impressed with what the Swedes are doing. Spotify came out of there and so on. So I do think there are a couple of these magnets that are actually quite strong.
I'm always impressed with what they're doing in Iceland and Estonia. But Iceland in particular, a tiny little country just doing all kinds of stuff. Everyone I know from Iceland is doing something cool. But, it's selection effects. It's,
Estonia is another really interesting one.
Estonia is sort of a separate category of digital transformation done right, done early, done with extraordinary success.
Yeah.
And they make it really easy to go there and to do business.
Yeah. I a lot of great lessons from Estonia. Lots of admiration for what they're doing.
Well, we're pretty much at the end of this. I asked you the last questions first. So I just wanted to give you the opportunity at the end. Is there anything we haven't covered that you wanted to touch on? Or are you kind of happy with
No, I think there's something, in some sense it's actually a message of hope, but the tech and entrepreneurship has become a much bigger part of society. We've talked quite a lot about sort of the differences between Silicon Valley, the undisputed leader, the U.S. capital markets, and then Europe. And I just think that you may have heard it, but I'll just reemphasize it. I've I think there's much more hope for other parts of the world. And I talked a lot about Europe. We could have talked a lot about Africa. I'm actually very bullish on entrepreneurship in Africa. I think there are huge opportunities, and I think there are really positive developments that are poorly understood. The thing with all of this entrepreneurship is you need patience, and you need to think in terms of decades. Back when I was, we were talking earlier on about the dot-com boom, and, in the 90s when I was studying venture capital, I was sort of just starting the topic. I tried to write about why does Europe doesn't have a venture capital industry. Piece of advice: never write a thesis about something that doesn't exist. I couldn't write that thesis because you can't explain why something doesn't exist. But it took 30 years, and today it exists. And everybody was telling me back in the 90s why Europe could never develop a venture capital industry, could never develop an entrepreneurship ecosystem. And most of the reasons were wrong. They were just, it took time. And they weren't completely wrong. It's difficult, but it can be done. And I have that message for now, for the rest of the world. I think entrepreneurship is thriving in Africa. I think in Africa we're going to see a really, interesting, distinct, and challenging, but we're going to see a venture capital industry, and that's true for other parts of the world too.
I look forward to seeing it. Thank you so much.
Cool. My pleasure.